it was encouraging, to know that the webinar was very impactful. So we take on the second lap of biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. This is what we are going to go for the next few minutes. Biodiversity is an interesting subject any day, anytime, and very technical and of high concern locally in countries and internationally as well. So this is why we'll be looking at the technical terminologies as much as possible. We'll define some of these terminologies for us to have a good grasp of it and see how to go from here. For instance, we'll be talking about biodiversity offsets, biodiversity hierarchy, and all that. So we'll just go one step after the other, and we'll take your questions as we go, so that we don't leave much behind. Or better still, we take the question after the submodal. Okay. So as introduced earlier, this is for biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. So, the Sustainable Development Fundamentals has a very key component that recognizes that protecting and conserving biodiversity is of utmost importance. Maintaining ecosystem services is of high importance, and sustaining or managing living natural resources are fundamental, to sustainable development. So this is the background with which we are discussing this. And of course, the IFC Performance Standard 6 specifies a lot of requirements for biodiversity conservation, which is also a major document we're using for this webinar. Okay, so the requirements set out in this subject have been guided by a Convention on Biological Diversity, which defines biodiversity. Let me grab the definition. It has a definition for biodiversity. Okay. It says that biodiversity is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystem, and the ecological complexities of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and all ecosystems. I will try to upload a document for this webinar so that you can see the definitions as specified, and even the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'll upload some documents. You can request it by email also, just in case you don't get it at info@richflood.com. You'll get the document having the different, having biodiversity definition and also Convention on biological diversity. So we dive in straight into the focus of this webinar, which is as you can see, we are going to be looking at the biodiversity offset, ecosystem services, protection and conservation of biodiversity, under which you have the modified habitat, natural habitat, critical habitat, legally protected and internationally recognized areas, invasive alien species, and so on and so forth. Okay, so basically the environmental and social risks and impact identification process establishes this particular subject. It's a key establishment for this particular subject. So it's important to note that the ESMS, which is a module we have taken before, you can subscribe down and go through the folders or the videos, you will find the ESMS, the module on ESMS, you know. So the implementation of the actions necessary to meet the biodiversity requirements is managed through the Environmental and Social Management System, ESMS, the elements of which we are going to cover in this particular webinar today. Okay, so based on the risks and impact identification process, the requirements apply to projects located in modified habitat, like you can see here, modified habitat, natural habitat, critical habitats. We are going to see the definitions of each of these habitats, you know, and it's based on the risks and impacts identified for the requirements, applied to projects that potentially impacts on the ecosystem services or that are actually dependent on the ecosystem services, okay, over which the proponent has direct management control or significant influence. So also that includes the production of living natural resources like agriculture, fisheries, forestry. These are all based on the risks and impacts identification process. So if there is a very good impact identification process, this categorization would easily be achieved without much hiccups. So the risks and impacts identification process has to consider direct and indirect project related impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I will try to do some definition for ecosystem services for our understanding. Okay, so it has to consider direct impact and indirect impact, and the process will also consider relevant threats to biodiversity. So like I said in the introductory aspect, that if we have a standard risks and impact identification process, it will make it easy for us to have already identified major issues that could lead to maybe habitat loss, maybe some form of degradation, maybe overexploitation issues, nutrient load changes. All of this would have been captured in the risks and impact identification process. Okay, it will also take into account the different values attached to biodiversity and ecosystem services by the communities through of course, the engagement processes or procedures that would, the values that the community are attaching to the ecosystem services would have been captured and would have been made available during the impact analysis through, of course, engagement of the communities. Okay, so as a matter of priority, actually, the proponent should seek to avoid impacts on biodiversity. Like we always say during our webinars, that the first thing is to avoid. Where avoidance is difficult to achieve, is to minimize. So, but as a priority, avoidance of impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services should be of topmost consideration. So, but when it's not possible, measures to minimize the impact and restore the biodiversity or ecosystem should be implemented. Where we cannot have avoidance, we have to have measures to implement the restoration plan for ecosystem, or to restore biodiversity to appreciable state. So, well, given the complexity in predicting project impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services over the long time, the proponent should adopt a practice of adaptive management, which is simply the implementation of mitigation and management measures, responsive to changing conditions and the result of monitoring throughout the project life cycle. So I will advise that the participants should get the performance standards document of the IFC, which would be a very good guide for all of these discussions we are having. In fact, most of it are gotten from the World Bank document, the IFC document. So it will be of a good resource for us to study further about the subject. So, well, adaptive management has to consider that there is a retainership of competent professionals to look into or to assist in conducting the risks and impact identification process, so that all of those impacts that are being mentioned, or the conditions surrounding it, or the community perspectives are being captured in a document, presentable to the financiers or presentable for implementation during the project life cycle. Okay, or an external expert can be retained with appropriate experience to assist in the development of mitigation measures, and of course the mitigation hierarchy, in order to make ease for implementation of findings. So let's go on straight to biodiversity offsets. I just want to have some uh, uh, basic definitions for us to understand some terminologies before we go deep into the different submodules in this module for biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. So first, let me say, for the protection and conservation of biodiversity, actually, the mitigation hierarchy includes biodiversity offsets. So biodiversity offsets are measurable conservation outcomes that are resulting from actions designed to compensate for significant residual adverse biodiversity impact arising from the project implementation or project development. Excuse me. Okay. So that's for biodiversity offsets. And okay, some biodiversity impacts are arising from project development, and after appropriate avoidance, minimization, and restoration measures have been taken, it can be said that biodiversity offsets, are being considered or have been put in place. It's just the conservation outcome that is being looked into by the proponent. Okay, measurable conservation outcomes for biodiversity must be demonstrated in situ on the ground and on an appropriate geographic scale. That's a landscape level or national level, if you like. So I put here the principle of like for like, or better principles, an in-kind offset and then out-of-kind offset. I'll try to the two different approach. So the first approach indicates that biodiversity offset must be designed to conserve the same biodiversity values that are being impacted by the project. The same biodiversity value that are being impacted by the project are said to be conserved. In certain situations, however, areas of biodiversity to be impacted by the project may be neither a national or local priority, and there may be other areas of biodiversity with like values that are a higher priority for conservation and sustainable use, and under imminent threat or need of protection or effective management. In this situation, it may be appropriate to consider an out-of-kind offset that involves trading up. That is where the offset targets biodiversity of higher priority than that affected by the project for critical habitats, most especially. Okay, so we will go forward for to capture ecosystem services here. But before we go further, I would like to talk a little about biodiversity. Let's go back a little. Let's go back to, oh, sorry. Okay. It's not coming up. I have a short video I wanted to show us to ease our understanding, but since it's not coming up, we'll just dive into the ecosystem services. Maybe later on, I'll try to show you the video. The video is just showing the biodiversity action plan. I mean, it's a voicing that I got on the YouTube, and I felt that it will be of great importance for you to share also in the video. Okay. So let's dive into ecosystem services. Okay. Just like the name implies, services, the ecosystem services are the benefits that people or businesses or communities derive from the ecosystem. So it is organized usually into 4 types: the provisioning services, the regulating services, the cultural services, and the support services. I'll try to explain each. The provisioning services are the products people obtain from the ecosystem. They are the products people obtain from the ecosystem. The regulating services are the benefits people obtain from the regulation of ecosystem processes. And then the cultural services are the non-material benefits people obtain from ecosystem. Then the supporting services are the natural processes that maintain the other ecosystems, ecosystem maintenance. That is for the supporting services. So ecosystems valued by humans are often underpinned by biodiversity. Impacts on biodiversity can therefore often adversely affect the delivery of the ecosystem. So we'll look at how proponents can sustainably manage and mitigate impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services throughout the project lifecycle. So the major objective is to protect and conserve the biodiversity, to maintain the benefits from the ecosystem services, to promote the sustainable management of living natural resources through the adoption and of practices that integrate conservation needs and development priority. So managing ecosystem services can be a little interesting, of course, complex in its kind, but interesting for implementation, most especially during the planning stage of the project. So where a project is likely to adversely impact ecosystem services, as determined by the identification process for the risks, as determined by the risks and impacts identification process, the proponent will conduct a systematic review to identify priority ecosystem services. Priority ecosystem services, which are usually of 2 kinds. Those services of which, first, project operations are most likely to have an impact, and therefore which result in adverse impacts to the community, and also those services on which the project is directly dependent for the operation, for instance, water. Okay, so when affected communities are likely to be impacted, they should participate in the determination of the prioritization, or sorry, in the prioritization, they should participate in the prioritization of the ecosystem services in accordance with the stakeholder engagement process that must have been undertaken while planning, at the inception level. So with respect to impacts on priority ecosystem services of relevance to the communities, and where the proponent has direct management control or significant influence over such services, adverse impacts should be avoided as much as possible. Adverse impacts should be avoided. If these impacts are unavoidable, then the proponent will minimize and implement mitigation measures that aim to maintain the value and functionality of the priority services. Okay, so with respect on priority ecosystem services on which the project depends, the proponent should minimize impact on ecosystem services and implement measures that increase resource efficiency for their operations, as described in our former model PS3. Okay, so I will go down into biodiversity protection and conservation. That's the next. Yeah, biodiversity protection and conservation as it is here. It looks a bit distorted here. I will try to adjust it. Okay. So it's a bit difficult to adjust. Okay. Well, this is where I want to actually discuss the habitats, the different types of habitats, and where possible, I can define the habitats for us based on the FC standards performance document. Okay. Habitat is defined as a terrestrial, freshwater, or marine geographical units or airway that supports assemblages of living organisms and their interactions with the non-living environment. Okay, so for the purpose of this discussion, habitats are divided into the several types that I have highlighted here. Okay, so you can see the modified habitat. As the name implies, you can begin to have an idea as we discuss it. Natural habitat, critically critical habitat, legally protected and internationally recognized habitat, and of course the invasive alien species or invasive alien species as seen here. Okay, that's my email. Okay. So for the protection and conservation of biodiversity, the mitigation hierarchy includes biodiversity offsets, as I have explained earlier, which may be considered only after appropriate avoidance, of impacts measures have been applied. So a biodiversity offset should be designed and implemented to achieve measurable outcome that can reasonably be expected to result in no net loss and preferably a net gain of biodiversity. However, a net gain is required in critical habitats because they are critical. So the design of a biodiversity offset must adhere to the like-for-like or better principle and must be carried out in alignment with best available information and current practices. Okay, so let me take on the habitat types and then we discuss them as we go. For the modified habitat, as the name implies, these are areas that may contain a large proportion of plants or animal species of non-native origin, and or human activity has substantially modified ecological function and species composition of this area. So modified habitats may include areas managed for agriculture, or forest plantation, for reclaimed coastal zones and reclaimed wetlands and so on. Okay, so for modified habitats that include significant biodiversity value, if that has been identified during the risk and impact identification process, then the client should minimize impact on such biodiversity and implement mitigation measures as appropriate. Same applies to the natural habitat, but of more stringent consideration. The natural habitats are those that are composed of viable assemblages of plants or animal species of largely native origin, unlike the modified habitat. This one is of largely native origin or where human activity has been essentially modified on areas' primary ecological function and species composition. Okay, so no other viable alternatives within the region. For this natural habitat, the client will have to go the extra mile to make sure that they will not significantly convert or degrade the natural habitat unless all the following are demonstrated. One, no other viable alternatives within the region for the project. Two, consultation has established the views of stakeholders, including the communities, of course, with respect to the extent of conversion and degradation. And then three, any conversion or degradation is mitigated according to the mitigation hierarchy. This is the condition where the client or the proponent will not convert or degrade natural unless the conditions I just mentioned, the three conditions I just mentioned, are demonstrated in full. So in areas of natural habitat mitigation, measures will be designed, mitigation measures will be designed to achieve no net loss on biodiversity where feasible. So the appropriate actions should just include avoidance, that's avoid impacts on biodiversity by identifying or by the identification and the protection of the set of species that have been identified in the process, and also by implementing minimization, impact minimization methods, for the habitat fragmented or the biological corridors around the project site, or the restoration of habitats during operations or after the operations, getting the biological biodiversity offsets, like I explained earlier. So for the critical habitat, I call it the critical habitat. There are areas of in fact, highest biodiversity, maybe not highest, but very high biodiversity values, including habitats of endangered species, maybe habitats of significant impact to endemic or restricted range species, habitats supporting globally significant concentrations of migratory species and or congregatory species. Okay, so highly threatened or unique ecosystem are also high biodiversity value, and areas associated with key evolutionary process. So in areas of this critical habitats, the proponents will not implement the project activity unless some certain measures are put in place or checked or studies are conducted to see that there is no other viable alternatives within the area for development of the project, or there is no modified habitat and there is no natural habitats that are critical. Okay, so another condition is that the project does not lead to measurable adverse impacts on those biodiversity for which the critical habitat was designated, and also if the project does not lead to a net reduction in the global or any critically endangered species over a reasonable period of time. So a robust, appropriate, designed and long-term biodiversity monitoring and evaluation program is very critical for this critical habitats. Okay, so the project's mitigation strategy will be described in a biodiversity action plan. In a biodiversity action plan, permit me to see if I can put up the biodiversity action plan. Yeah, here we are. Okay. This is just talking about the biodiversity action plan definition from Wikipedia, from USOS.
A Biodiversity Action Plan (BAP) is an internationally recognized program addressing threatened species and habitats, and is designed to protect and restore biological systems. The original impetus for these plans derives from the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD). As of 2009, 191 countries have ratified the CBD, but only a fraction of these have developed substantive BAP documents. The principal elements of a BAP typically include A. Preparing inventories of biological information for selected species or habitats. B. Assessing the conservation status of species within specified ecosystems. C. Creation of targets for conservation and restoration. And D. Establishing budgets, timelines and institutional partnerships for implementing the BAP. A fundamental method of engagement to a BAP is thorough documentation regarding individual species, with emphasis upon the population distribution and conservation status. This task, while fundamental, is highly daunting, since only an estimated 10% of the world's species are believed to have been characterized as of 2006, most of these unknowns being fungi, invertebrate animals, microorganisms and plants. For many bird, mammal and reptile species, information is often available in published literature. However, for fungi, invertebrate animals, microorganisms and many plants, such information may require considerable local data collection. It is also useful to compile time trends of population estimates in order to understand the dynamics of population variability and vulnerability. In some parts of the world, complete species inventories are not realistic. For example, in the Madagascar dry deciduous forests, many species are completely undocumented and much of the region has never even been systematically explored by scientists. A species plan component of a country's BAP should ideally entail a thorough description of the range, habitat, behavior, breeding and interaction with other species. Once a determination has been made of conservation status, for example rare, endangered, threatened, vulnerable, a plan can then be created to conserve and restore the species population to target levels. Examples of programmatic protection elements are habitat restoration, protection of habitat from urban development, establishment of property ownership, limitations on grazing or other agricultural encroachment into habitat, reduction of slash-and-burn agricultural practices, outlawing killing or collecting the species, restrictions on pesticide use, and control of other environmental pollution. The plan should also articulate which public and private agencies should implement the protection strategy and indicate budgets available to execute the strategy. Where a number of threatened species depend upon a specific habitat, it may be appropriate to prepare a habitat protection element of the Biodiversity Action Plan. Examples of such special habitats are raised acidic bogs of Scotland, Waterberg Biosphere bushveld in South Africa, California's coastal wetlands, and Sweden's Stora Alvaret on the island of Åland. In this case also, careful inventories of species and also the geographic extent and quality of the habitat must be documented. Then, as with species plans, a program can be created to protect, enhance and/or restore habitat using similar strategies as discussed above under the species plans.
Okay, so welcome back. That was a short break for me as well. So, well, the BAP that was described in an introductory manner in that video is what has to be designed to achieve net gains of those biodiversity values, as we discussed earlier, for which the critical habitat was designated. When I say net gains, okay, let me hear if you're still there. Net gains, what do we mean by net gains? I explained it earlier. Let me see if you're following. What do we mean by net gains when it comes to the biodiversity values? The biodiversity values, what do we mean by net gains? You know, we talked about the biodiversity offsets from conservation outcomes, right? So what about net gains? Okay, somebody just said You said net. Well, that's funny. Let me not read it out. Okay. So, well, net gains are additional conservation outcomes that can be achieved for the biodiversity values for which the critical habitat was designated. So it can be achieved through, net gains can be achieved through the development of a biodiversity offset. In instances without a biodiversity offset, the proponent can achieve net gains through the implementation of programs that could be implemented in situ. Remember, we discussed about this to enhance habitat and protect and conserve biodiversity. So in instances where biodiversity offsets are proposed as part of the mitigation strategy, the proponent must demonstrate through an assessment that the project's significant impacts on biodiversity, residual impacts on biodiversity will be adequately mitigated to meet the requirements of the IFC. Okay, so that's about the critical habitat. We'll take a break and then come back for the legally protected and the invasive alien species. But let me take your questions so far so that we can pause here and take some tea if you like and do some refreshment. And then we get back here to continue about the legally protected areas. We discuss about that and then we can move forward based on our webinar outline. We're still having the sustainable management of living natural resources to discuss, and also having the supply chain to discuss further. Okay, so let us take a break, but I can see you're typing some questions. No problem, type them. We'll have a long time interacting on this. I can see quite a number, about 6 to 7 persons already posting some comments and questions. So no problem, we get back after this short break.